the testimony after I left the Senate, the guard's name that was one of my closest guards, his name was Brian.
Mm-hmm.
He worked for, I think he was with ICE, I can't remember. But after we left the Senate chamber, he because he had been very icy, no pun intended, towards me until he heard my testimony. After I left the Senate chamber, he turned to me and he said, "Mr. Nawaz, can I shake your hand?" I said, "Sure, why?" He said, up until I heard your testimony, I thought I was protecting America from you. Now I realize I need to protect you from everybody else, and I want to shake your hand." I said, "Oh, thank you." So he actually listened clearly, quite intently. We became, I don't want to say friends, but we stayed in touch for a while after that. And I still have his details, but it was a very interesting and surreal experience.
Wow. Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's wolfnyc, WOLFNYC.com. Maajid Nawaz, welcome to the What is Money Show.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to be here. A lovely place, by the way.
Thank you so much. You are officially the second guest in our Nashville studio, so this is super cool.
Who was the first?
Andrew Bustamante, CIA, ex-CIA guy, also very interesting.
So I'm following the ex-CIA guy.
Yeah, very interesting conversation as well. But yeah, I think we'll be going down some similar rabbit holes today. So I guess by way of quick introduction, how I was introduced to your work was I heard you appear on the Joe Rogan podcast. You guys did, I think this maybe was your second appearance together. You guys did like a 4-hour episode. I distinctly remember driving through Kauai, listening to your story and being moved emotionally several times. It's a very extreme story. You've seen a lot of different sides of humanity in your life.
It's surreal slightly. I sometimes pinch myself because I was last night. I was in we're in Nashville.
Yes,
I should say this is my second home. I was married in this city. My son was born in this state, married to an American Tennessean from Knoxville. And it's really always a pleasure to be back in this city. And it's changed a lot since we married here. But this is our second home. Our primary home currently is in London, but we're between both places. And so last night I was with my wife, and I was just reflecting. We went out for dinner because we've come for the 3-hour drive from Knoxville here just to see you. So I said to her, come for a dinner and we'll spend the evening together. And one of the reflections we had is actually, I still find it very surreal. My first time I came to this country to the United States of America, I was blacklisted. I wasn't allowed in. I was banned from entering the United States because I have a prison record, and you have to declare that. But my prison record, clearly, though not a criminal offense, I was a political prisoner because it was during the War on Terror, and I was detained in Egypt and arrested for attempting to overthrow the Egyptian government. Of course, the US at the time, at the peak of the War on Terror with George Bush as president, took that quite seriously and decided I was a persona non grata, that I should not be allowed into the United States of America. So it was funny because, as I say, it's surreal sometimes to think about it. I was blacklisted from entering the country, but received an invitation from then Senator Lieberman, who was chairing the committee, the Senate Committee on Homeland Security. And he asked me to come and testify because I'd started to speak out against ideological extremism emanating from my faith tradition. I am a Muslim and proud to be a Muslim. But as the Prophet Muhammad once said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْغَلُوَّ فِي الدِّينِ, in one of his hadith or traditions, he said, be aware of extremism in religion. إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْغَلُوَّ فِي الدِّينِ. It's a confirmed saying of the Prophet Muhammad. And I, having succumbed in my childhood to, which for reasons we can go into, but to some of the more extreme elements of the ideological narratives that were prevalent, particularly during the decade of the so-called War on Terror, that were prevalent on the Muslim side. Of course, there was extremism prevalent on the government side as well. But I had succumbed to that, and that's why I ended up in as a political prisoner in Egypt. So I was blacklisted from coming into this country, and Senator Lieberman wanted me to come and speak to all of this extremism stuff in the Senate. And they invited me, and one day before I was due to travel to fly out there, we realized that I couldn't come in. So Senator Lieberman, at the time, he went slightly ballistic because he wanted his star witness to attend. It was the first time in history that a former Islamist political prisoner would be testifying in Congress. So in the end, literally with a couple of hours to fly, it's a funny story, I got a phone call from this anonymous man who was purporting to be from the US Embassy. And he said to me, Mr. Nawaz, he said, I am calling on behalf of the US government, and would you like to meet us in the airport 1 hour before you're due to check in? I said, sure. He said, it's about your visa. We found a solution. I said, all right. I said, how will I recognize you? This is a true story. I said, how will I recognize you? He said, I'll be wearing a blue raincoat. So I went to the airport, and I found this man standing underneath this information desk with a blue raincoat on, and he handed me 3 brown envelopes. And I said, what are these? And he said, well, these are your parole visas. And I said, what's a parole visa? He said, it's a visa we give mafia bosses who are convicted and therefore barred from entering the United States of America because they're serving prison time. But we need them to testify against US mafia. So we give them what's called a parole visa. I said, great, doesn't matter. You're going to get me in to testify at the Senate. He said, well, there's a catch. I said, what's that? He said, the conditions of a parole visa is you have to remain under 24/7 armed guard. Because actually it only works if you're on parole. Now, I know you're not on parole, and I'm very sorry, but it does mean that you're going to enter the United States under effective arrest. And I said, oh my God. I said, listen, fine, if it gets me to testify at the Senate, I've seen a lot worse. I said, why are there 3 brown envelopes? And he said, well, this is the content of the visa. He said, there's one to give into the check-in desk on this end at Heathrow. The other you have to surrender to the Immigration Customs Enforcement on the other side. And the third one is for you to keep, which I still have, by the way. I said, all right, great. He said, sir, there's another catch. Please don't get offended. I said, what's that? He said, when we get to the other side, Immigration Customs Enforcement are going to take your fingerprints because you're officially under arrest. I said, okay, fair enough. So I came in, and they took my fingerprints and everything. And from that moment at the airport at Washington, D.C., at the Dulles Airport, all the way for the entire journey, I was kept under 24/7 armed guard with snipers in the hotel room opposite me. I don't know why they put snipers there, but they did. And was under permanent escort. But I did manage eventually to testify. That's online, the testimony. There's both the written version of it. This is 2007, a year after my release from prison. The written version of it, as well as the video, It's a matter of record. And it's interesting because what I testified to at the Senate in the time has, I think, stood the test of time. In that I articulated a lot of my early thinking around the distinction between Islam, the faith, and what I came to call the Islamist ideology, which in one sentence I'll say is the desire to impose any given version of Islam over society. I believe it was the I believe it was the interwar European political trends, fascist trends between World War I and World War II that had permeated into the Middle East and influenced Muslim thinking that gave rise to this desire to create a hierarchical clergy within Islam where Islam never had such a clergy. In other words, it's a very Catholic concept. But anyway, that's again another conversation. But it's all there. It's on the testimony in official record in the Senate. And I was just reflecting on this last night because there's no way I dreamed of at the time entering the United States for the first time in such conditions under 24/7 armed guard that I would eventually be married to somebody from this very state in Tennessee and have a child who was born here and have family here. So it's a very surreal experience. One last thing from that, the testimony after I left the Senate, the guard's name that was one of my closest guards, his name was Brian. He worked for, I think he was with ICE, I can't remember. But after we left the Senate chamber, he because he had been very icy, no pun intended, towards me until he heard my testimony. After I left the Senate chamber, he turned to me and he said, "Mr. Nawaz, can I shake your hand?" I said, "Sure, why?" He said, up until I heard your testimony, I thought I was protecting America from you. Now I realize I need to protect you from everybody else, and I want to shake your hand." I said, "Oh, thank you." So he actually listened clearly, quite intently. We became, I don't want to say friends, but we stayed in touch for a while after that. And I still have his details, but it was a very interesting and surreal experience.
Wow. That's fascinating stuff. So what you mentioned something there, the imposition of an ideology is where you drew the line between, I guess, the faith and I think you said ideological imposition or capture.
Yeah.
Is that the line? It's coercion.
Well, let me say something unequivocally that is historically a matter of record that most people today don't realize and assume the opposite. And that is that traditional Islam, and I'm talking about prior to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, traditional Islam has been legally pluralistic, and Muslims traditionally, in the overwhelming majority in terms of numbers, but also in terms of just authority of tradition and theological grounding, have not imposed any given version of Islam over society. In fact, that concept is not only a modern innovation, it is if you speak to traditional Muslims, and I have a teacher, a spiritual mentor, Sheikh Ali Abdul Qadir al-Qadri. He's a scholar who is Malaysia-based but travels globally, of the Qadiriya spiritual order. And we are very well connected through our teacher and through our tradition with a firm grounding in what traditional Islam teaches. So it's not just in terms of numbers, but also the teaching. Islam was not defined by this desire to impose one version or one reading over society. In fact, the exceptions to that you find were very interestingly in Europe. So the two exceptions to that, the first was that you may have heard that Spain once had a 900-year period of Islamic rule. Most people don't remember that actually, but it's very interesting. Andalusia, or the southern part of Spain, where today you will see the remnants like Alhambra Palace, one of the most beautiful wonders of the world. I highly recommend everybody to go and see it. I in fact wanted to go. My wedding that ended up happening here in Nashville, I wanted it initially to happen there because it, for me, represented the coexistence of Catholicism and Islam in Europe. But of course, that all came to an end with the Inquisition. But the remnants of that you still see there in Spain. But for that 900-year period of Islamic rule in Spain, now think about that. 900 years is no joke. Towards the end of that period, the Frankish invasions from the north were in an attempt or the Reconquista, so the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Spain, that threatened the remnants of the Umayyad dynasty in Spain who had ruled there. And they were there because they fled the coup against them in the Middle East by the Abbasid dynasty. So you heard of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyads who fled them because they were then purged from Iraq and other areas. They settled in Spain. Eventually, the Frankish invasions from the north were seeking to remove any remnants of Islamic influence in Spain. And in an attempt to keep Islamic Spain united, the Umayyads in Spain, for the first time, decided that they needed legal unity and cultural unity. So they adopted one particular reading from the four main schools of jurisprudence in Islam. There are many schools of Islamic jurisprudence, but there are four main ones: the Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools. To roughly place them, people in South Asia are Hanafi, people in North Africa are Maliki, people in, say, the Gulf region in Saudi Arabia are Hanbali, and the Shafi'i are mainly in the Levant region. That's all roughly, it's not precise. But in Islamic Spain, to try and keep the population united against what they saw as a foreign threat, they adopted the Maliki school of jurisprudence as law. That was one of the first times that was done. The desire to impose one interpretation over society. Ironically, it was in Europe. The other time it was done was with the decline of the Ottoman Caliphate, which was removed in 1924, post-World War I. And for the same reasons, the Ottomans feeling the loss of their empire, which you can even see today with the decline of the American empire globally and the way in which the media is attempting to force one hegemonic narrative over people. It's what happens when empires are declining. They try and hold on to power. So the Ottomans tried this, and they tried to impose the Hanafi, because Turks are Hanafi, they tried to impose the Hanafi in school of jurisprudence over society. That failed, but the Ottomans ended up with something that was more true to tradition before the collapse of the empire, and that was known as the millet system. And the millet system was a legally pluralistic system. So the Ottoman Caliphate, which is the last example of a legitimate Islamic caliphate on the planet, had a legally pluralistic system. Now that means that if Robert disputes with Mike here and is in Ottoman Turkey, Robert can choose whether, if they define themselves as Christian, to go to a Christian arbiter for their dispute, if they're Jewish, to go to a Jewish arbiter, if they're whatever, Muslim, to go to a Muslim arbiter. That was a legally pluralistic system. It didn't have one law for the whole land, but rather it was based on arbitration. The legal unitary systems came about in Europe. They are very much tied to the concepts of the nation state and the Westphalian principle. And that's why I say that the modern Islamist project is directly influenced by this idea that you have to have one law for the entire country. Now, that idea in itself didn't exist in history until the idea of the modern nation state came about. And it's impossible for anyone before the idea of the modern nation state came about to have come up with the idea of having one canon. The word they used to use in Arabic is qanun, canon being a canon of law. To have one canon for the entire country, it wasn't the case. Constitutions didn't exist. People hadn't thought of these ideas. So when you hear modern Islamists say, as they do, by the way, their slogans, so the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was founded after the destruction of the Ottoman Caliphate, their slogan, quite literally, their founding slogan was Islam is our way, Islam is our ideology, the Quran is our constitution, and jihad is our way. Now, that's in their founding slogan, Qur'anuna dasturuna. It's their slogan, Quran is our constitution. The word dastur, which means constitution in Arabic, again, it's you will not find it in traditional Islamic texts, because it's like looking for the word internet in traditional Islamic texts. The idea had not yet been invented. Right? Yes. So this idea that you have to have even an Islamic constitution is an amalgamation, an attempt to reconcile modern political thinking with tradition. But that reconciliation in the case of Islamists went along the lines of the very Westphalian European concept, which ended up, again, we're back to the interwar period. It ended up with fascism in Europe. And that's where the influence comes from Islamists. But traditional Islam, prior to all of that influence, was thoroughly legally pluralistic, was actually opposed to imposing one version of Sharia or Islamic jurisprudence over society. And my task since leaving the former group that I was a leader of and for which I was imprisoned in Egypt, my task has been to draw these clarifications for people and these distinctions, because during the war on terror, of course, they had the other problem, and that was the state-led and also media, in particular, corporatist media-led narrative that Islamism is Islam, that all Muslims do seek to take over. And it was a very difficult time to try and draw these distinctions, because, of course, I was facing attack from both those who believe that all Muslims are terrorists and those Islamists who believed it was somehow our religious duty to impose Islam over everybody.
Right. Wow. Yeah. A lot there. So maybe we should jump into that a little bit, just a little bit of your story, because you come from a background in which you were effectively radicalized, I think relatively at a young age.
Yeah.
And then you have a long arc that brings you to kind of a reformation of sorts and actually embracing Western values that you had formerly opposed or at least, I guess, been radically indoctrinated against, perhaps. We talk about this a lot on the show, like the nature of storytelling itself. Plato has this famous quote that those who tell stories rule society. And clearly in the past 3 years in the post pandemic world, we have seen how important these narratives are. We now are seeing a lot of censorship online, a lot of effort being applied to controlling narratives or for spinning up narratives, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we could just, I know you've told this story a million times. I don't want to press you down into the weeds on it, but I think it's a beautiful framing of your life and talking about your journey from kind of radicalization to reformation. And it adds a lot of context for everything else we're going to discuss. So I don't know if there's like a maybe 20-minute version you could give us. For people that want to hear the longer version, obviously you've given this on the Rogan podcast. You mentioned another one you've done recently.
Patrick Bet-David.
Patrick Bet-David. So if they wanted a deeper dive on your story, they could go there.
And if they want an even deeper dive, it's the subject of an autobiography published by Random House Penguin. It's called Radical by Maajid Nawaz, and it goes into the entire story. But I will summarize it because, as you say, it's available on other platforms. We can spend a lot more time on discussing some of the contemporary and ideological elements. But I was born and raised in Southend-on-Sea in Essex, a place next door to London. And at the time, we were the first generation of Muslims born in the UK. My parents were immigrants from Pakistan, and my grandfather also immigrated with them. But before our generation, Muslims weren't born in Europe, and Britain was the leader in that regard. So continental European countries, even till this day, those that were born and raised in Europe are probably slightly younger than our generation. I'm 45 years old now, but we were pretty much the first generation born in the UK to Muslim parents who migrated from the East and the Middle East. Now, what comes with that? I say to people, just imagine the challenges of, the US has known to have challenges with African-American relations with broader society and the various questions around historic injustices. We'd come from post-colonial contexts, but not only were we of a visibly different nature, but unlike the majority of African Americans, at least in this country, we also had a very, very different cultural reference point and religious reference points. I think that those two that was the most prominent difference beyond skin color. And of course, all of the tensions that come with that, navigating our identity in that context for the first time in history, to be born and raised as British citizens, but trying to work out where we stood vis-a-vis a very, very strained post-colonial identity. All of the migration patterns in Europe came from that context. So in France with the North Africans, of course, French colonies were in North Africa, and in Britain was South Asia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And it was, as a result, a lot of tensions emerged. In my case in particular, I could count the number of people that were like me on one hand in the entire borough. Essex is a borough next to London. And it was relatively okay up until the teenage years, where I faced a lot of violent racism, which, when I say violent racism, I mean actually very, very violent. Hammer attacks, machete attacks. Before the age of 16 years old, I'd probably seen more people stabbed and attacked with hammers and machetes than most people have in their lifetime. I've probably been in more machete fights than most people have in their lifetime. I've been probably stood next to people that have been stabbed all over their bodies, and more so than most people will have to ever see. But then that's before the age of 16. By the age of 17, I was involved in the first, what I think is probably London's first jihadist street murder, but it was murder by machete attack. But in this instance, it was, by this time, it was somebody on my side that was, I believe, defending themselves, but ultimately led to the death of the person they were defending themselves against in East London. But this was a very violent upbringing that I had. And it was a very, as a result, very traumatic upbringing for a teenager to go through. But at the time, as we were going through all of this, the Bosnia genocide began to unfold, and they were also Muslim. So we felt already quite disenfranchised from society, quite disconnected from the institutions that were there, meant to be there to protect us. And then on top of that, you had the monumental failure of the institution of government in the former Yugoslavia that led to the civil war in that country. And all of that, it left us open, very open to desiring a sense of belonging outside of the mainstream. My father was a blue-collar worker in the Libyan desert. He worked in the Sahara Desert all his life on the oil rigs as a electrical engineer. So he wasn't at home. So we were looking, he had to work to pay the bills. And so we were looking for that kind of older male figure. And we found it eventually in these Islamist organizations that at the time were recruiting en masse throughout the UK among the Muslim communities. At the age of 16, I joined an organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which means the Party of Liberation. It was founded in 1953 in Jerusalem. And its basic aim was to resurrect the caliphate that we've just been speaking of. The Ottoman Caliphate was dismantled after World War I at the hands of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1924. And we wanted to resurrect this kind of global Muslim empire that we felt should impose one version of Islam over society and then conquer the rest of the world through jihad. That's what I subscribed to at 16 years old. This was before Al-Qaeda came about, so I don't want to give the wrong impression. This was not a terrorist organization. It remains legal. My former group remains legal both in the United States and across Europe, in fact, throughout the Western world, because its means to come to power was to recruit army officers and try and incite some form of palace coup from within as opposed to blow things up. So this is still not a prescribed terrorist organization. I need to make that clear because I've never been suspected nor accused of any terrorism offense, and nor would I be, because the group is avowedly anti-terrorism. Al-Qaeda came about afterwards as an offshoot, but as happens with these things, you start down one line and it becomes more and more extreme as people, try and outdo each other. A bit like Stalin versus Trotsky. In the end, I ended up on the leadership of this group in the UK, and ended up exporting this group to different countries. In 1999, I was among the first, I think the first British Pakistani member to relocate to Pakistan to export the group there. I was involved in recruiting Pakistani army officers to this organization. All of us were subsequently arrested. I was involved in exporting it from Britain to Denmark. Eventually, I ended up in Egypt. And I landed in Egypt one day before the 9/11 attacks, which is what changed everything in terms of the security climate around the world. Once 9/11 happened, which was a completely different group, we were a few months after that. So 9/11 September. By March the next year, we were all rounded up, the entire group in Egypt. I was head of the Alexandria chapter for the organization. Hundreds of us were arrested in dawn raids at gunpoint. That was actually the second time I was arrested at gunpoint. I'd been arrested already at 15 in Essex. At 15 years old, I'd been arrested on suspicion of armed robbery at gunpoint by Essex police authorities. But that was also false. We were released the next day with an apology. But you can see I was already primed to hate society they couldn't interrogate me in the police station because I was too young, so they had to call my mother. And they called her at 3 a.m. and said, "We've got your 15-year-old. We've arrested him for suspicion of armed robbery. You have to come to the police station." So she was very shocked. My brother was with me at the time. But this time in Egypt, it was grenades and machine guns as well. And they blindfolded us and they tied our hands behind our backs.
These are U.S. operatives?
This was Egyptian state security.
Okay.
Very serious. They are. If you think Guantanamo Bay is bad, this is nothing. This is Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, even all the abuse images that we saw from the prison in Iraq in Abu Ghraib. These all pale in comparison to what the Arab prisons do to their detainees. And the Arab dictators have been notorious for what they do. I mean, whatever we think of Gaddafi's removal, Assad's civil war, Mubarak's removal, these guys were brutal. Saddam's removal. Saddam was known to take Black & Decker drills and drill them through the heads of prisoners. I've met people that have witnessed that. In Egypt, what we witnessed was electrocution on the teeth and genitalia for the purposes of torture interrogation. They would torture children in front of parents to force parents to confess. They would rape wives in front of husbands to force husbands to confess. It was brutal. We had people detained without charge for over 25 years, held in prison incommunicado, with no charge, let alone conviction. We were dragged through that torture dungeon. I was held in a torture dungeon for 4 days in Egypt with my hands tied behind my back, and I was blindfolded. And I was given a number. My number was 42, and they read through the numbers in chronological order. The numbers went into their hundreds. And they went one by one in chronological order and tortured everybody and forced us to listen to their screams. And they would go through the numbers. And so by the time number 41's turn was up, he was next to me. He was crying, the poor man. And he asked me to help him. I read him, sticks with me till this day. I read him a passage from the Quran called Surah Al-Buruj, وَالسَّمَاءِ ذَاتِ الْبُرُوجِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْمَعُودِ وَشَاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ قُتِلَ أَصْحَابُ الْأُخْدُودِ. And the passage is a story actually about a time before Islam, when, because Islam is an Abrahamic faith, we believe in all of the Abrahamic prophets from Adam all the way through. Think of all the Old Testament prophets. They are our prophets. We believe, in fact, that's our tradition. Of course, the age-old debate is whether whether Jesus was accepted by the Jews, and we say, was Muhammad accepted by the Christians? It's the same conversation.
Right.
And so this story that I read to this number 41 was about a Christian boy that was tortured for his faith in one God. And of course, for us, that's a Muslim story. So I read him that passage. He thanked me and his number was called, and then I had to listen to him scream as he was tortured and electrocuted. And then they dumped his body next to me and they called my number up. And for whatever reason, when I was asked to tell them what I was doing in Egypt and whatever, I stuck to what we'd been trained to say. I said, my name is Maajid Nawaz. I'm a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir and from Britain, and I have nothing more to say to you. And he said, right, you've got another day to think about that. He'd just tortured my friend in front of me, and he said, who was also a British citizen. His name was Reza Pankhurst. And he said, you got one more day to think about the fact that you don't want to answer our questions, otherwise we'll do to you what we just did to your friend. In that moment, in that time between the day expiring and me having to go back to face my interrogator, the British embassy finally made contact. They should have got us out there within 48 hours, but they made contact in the 4-day period. And then we were taken out of that dungeon. So I was saved by the bell.
Wow.
And we were put into solitary confinement for 4 months. And we had 15 minutes break a day. It was a bare cell with no toilet and no sanitation. We had to basically relieve ourselves on the floor and use a bucket in that 15-minute break to wash the floor down. Eventually, we were charged with charges that began as attempting to overthrow the Egyptian government. The convictions in the end were a lot lighter than that. We were convicted for propagation by speech and writing for the ideas of an organization that doesn't have a permit to operate. That was the eventual conviction. Wow. I remember it till this day, the Arabic charge, ترويج بالقول والكتابة لجماعات غير مشروعة. That was the charge that we were eventually convicted for. We got 5 years in prison, but because the charge was, as I just read to you, Amnesty International adopted us as prisoners of conscience because the conviction was very, very overtly sentencing us for ideas they didn't like, which was the idea of resurrecting this caliphate that I've just... So Amnesty got involved. This is the peak of the war on terror. Just imagine 9/11 has just happened. In fact, Iraq was invaded while we were in prison. So people often, when I speak to people, and they were like, yeah, I was against the Iraq war. I'm like, yeah, I was in prison opposing the Iraq war in Egypt from our jail cells. We rioted at the time Iraq was invaded. But that sentence lasted for 5 years. And eventually I was released and returned to the UK in 2006. 2006. And my time in prison, those 5 years in prison, I spent a lot of time studying and reading and debating across the political spectrum of political prisoners. And I came to the conclusion that what I'd spent up until then, I was 24 years old, by the way, when I was taken to the torture dungeon. So from the age of 16 to 24 is what everything I just described to you happened. But for me, it felt like a lifetime. And I, upon my release at the age of 28 years old, could no longer subscribe to the ideology that led me to that situation. After the intense debates and study, I spent those 5 years sentence, or 4 and a bit years in prison, intensely studying traditional Islamic theology, jurisprudence, Quranic recitation and memorization, debated with the who's who of the Islamist scholars at the time in the world, because it all began in Egypt, but also the Islamic scholars that were interned as well. And I came out with a really, really thorough Islamic and political education, and could no longer sustain my false belief that the ideology I had come to adopt was Islam. I could no longer sustain that. But I didn't want to leave that in prison. I felt that looked weak. So I waited. I completed my full sentence, came out, and in fact gave a BBC Hard Talk interview with Sarah Montague, where I was still a member of the group, which is still available online for people to see. That was a 28-year-old me. But about a year or just under a year after that interview is when I left the group, because they asked me to become a leader, or the leader in Britain for the organization. But I felt that was going to be hypocritical, because I really couldn't subscribe to those ideas anymore.
What was it, the education-wise, or these ethical debates that you're engaging in inside of prison, what was it that actually transformed your view and wanted you to move away from the ideological position back towards the faith? And you mentioned coercion earlier. Like, was that line?
Well, so the what we led with, or kicked off with, that kind of conversation. The thing is, I was in prison with people that would have known, because the assassins of the former president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, he was assassinated in 1981 by Islamic Jihad after he tried to make peace with Israel. And those that were not executed in that case were given life sentences, and they were my cellmates. So by that time, they'd been in prison for longer than I was alive, by a year. So these, if you think about it, these were like the guys we used to emulate. And now I'm in jail with them. So I had 5 years to debate with people like this. Now, these guys and all the others, the leader of the largest terrorist group in Egypt at that time, which was Gamal Islamiyah, he was with me in jail. The leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, he was with me in jail, which is not a terrorist organization. That's a political Islamist organization. And so those 5 years debating with all of literally the who's who of the global Islamist and jihadist scene, it all began in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood founded in Egypt. The leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri, the current leader, his group, he was in that same prison complex, by the way. The founding ideologue of modern-day Islamism, Sayyid Qutb, who wrote Milestones, which is known as a Das Kapital for Islamists. He was held in the very prison I was in. He wrote the book in the very prison I was in. So that's history right there for the Islamist ideological scene. And I spent those 5 years debating and discussing with very senior jihadists and Islamists, and attempting, in fact, initially to convince them of my organization. But by that time, what I found really interesting was that they had come to moderate their views and move away from their previously held convictions. And in fact, they started writing about this in a series of pamphlets called Al-Muraja'at, or the revisions. These are, in Arabic, they are ideological revisions, correcting literally in the subtitle is Tasihul Mafahim, or the correction of the concepts. And they are correcting the distinction between what had become the Islamist ideology and its rigidity and inflexibility and intolerance with the traditional Islamic teachings. I've still got these books at home with all my handwritten Arabic notes in the sidelines and margins, because I studied these and debated these with their authors in prison. And it helped to moderate my views. And though those books were debunking jihadist violence as a means for change, I was able to apply the principles on the Islamist ideology itself. And I should define that. If Islamism is the desire to impose one version of Islam over society, jihadism is the use of force to bring about Islamism. So they're distinct.
Gotcha.
But both are in turn distinct from Islam and jihad. So I'm adding the ism to denote the politicization of traditional values of Islam and traditional values of jihad. Jihad just means struggle, and primarily it's an internal struggle with the self.
Got it.
But jihadism is the use of force to implement Islamism. And that's why you'll see Islamist groups, Muslim Brotherhood, my former group, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and you'll see jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And the difference is the violence, they use violence as a means for change, and these guys don't.
Yes. Wow. Interesting.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, iCoin Technology. iCoin has just released a sleek new hardware wallet. Looks like a mini iPhone, with a little touch screen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, no GPS. It's a strictly physically cold hardware wallet. Like I said, it's got a high-res 3-inch touchscreen. It's got a camera for air gapping the wallet. It's got optional Bluetooth compatibility. And it's really a brand new UI, UX experience for a hardware wallet, making it very accessible, easy to use, not intimidating. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like iCoin Wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. Go to iCointechnology.com today and use promo code Bitcoin23 for 30% off of this new sleek hardware wallet.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, the Gold Investment Letter. The Gold Investment Letter helps sophisticated investors navigate capital markets and maximize their profits in trading gold, silver, and mining stocks. The Gold Investment Letter seeks out the most undervalued companies and identifies special situations in the mining sector, and then provides in-depth analysis on both their financial positions and future prospects. The Gold Investment Letter explores many complex domains such as investor psychology, portfolio management, and macroeconomic trends, all with the goal of making you a better investor. The Gold Investment Letter offers a free version and a paid premium version, and I strongly recommend you at least sign up for the free version, because after having read a few of these issues, I can promise you it is a treasure trove of good information. You can sign up for the free newsletter today at goldinvestmentletter.com.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, CrowdHealth. CrowdHealth is a Bitcoin-enabled alternative to legacy health insurance. Now let's face it, legacy health insurance is an absolute scam. Nobody can explain this better than the legendary comedian Chris Rock.
Insurance. You got to have some insurance. You got to. There's an insurance. They shouldn't even call it insurance. They should just call it in case shit. Like, I give a company some money in case shit happens. Now, if shit don't happen, shouldn't I get my money back?
So with CrowdHealth, instead of just paying premiums that you'll never see again, you can hold part of this pool of savings in dollars and in Bitcoin through CrowdHealth. And when you have a health event, you can draw against this pool of communal savings. So go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove to learn more or sign up.
I have a quote from you here, and I'm not sure where it falls in, but I believe when you were arrested at 24, you said, right?
24.
You were taken away also from your family and your child.
My child was in my arms,
Child was in your arms.
He was 1 at the time.
Forcibly removed,
At
presumably,
gunpoint.
and you were arrested. I'll read this quote here, which I think comes from that time period. You said that my marriage fell apart and my entire identity up until that point had been defined by families and friends around this ideology and organization, all of that.
Yeah.
Imagine you've been plucked out of your reality and you have to reconstruct yourself from nothing. But on top of that, you've just come out of jail. The war on terror is at its peak. Tony Blair is prime minister and Bush Jr. is president.
So the world hates you because everyone thinks you are the enemy. You've just lost all your friends and you have to build yourself back up again from nothing with nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I bought a house in cash in London about 3 years ago.
So that
managed to do it somehow.
What an arc. So
that was, by the way, because I sued the Southern Poverty Law Centre and won a 3.4 million defamation lawsuit. So I managed to buy a house as a result.
Good for you.
Yeah.
How did you withstand the emotional trauma of that? I mean, I can't even imagine having your child ripped out of your arms and then you're sent to jail for 5 years, I believe you said. Does that mean you didn't see your child for that entire
No, I didn't. No, so we're still... So my wife left me and raised my son. He's now 22. I'm very proud of him. He also went to Egypt to study Arabic eventually, and now he teaches Arabic 3 times a week. He's studying computer programming. But we are, at the moment, it's difficult. And I make every excuse for him because he is a product of being born to the war on terror era with his father unjustly imprisoned and subjected to witnessing torture. And how that shapes a child that knows, clearly he knows, it's part of the story that's been told to him, that he was taken from my arms at 3 a.m. at gunpoint. And of course, his life is, irrevocably altered as a result.
Sure.
So he's grown up with his own view on the world, and I respect the journey that he's going to have to take to come to reconcile what I then subsequently did after leaving prison in challenging the ideology that at the time his own mother used to subscribe to, like I did. She's also, credit to her, moved away from that since and did a very good job in raising him. But on a human level, I don't think I could expect everybody to reconcile things the way I think I've tried to. I don't think that's fair on people. I can't explain why I've managed to do what I've done or land where I've landed. And I don't think it would be fair for me to try and explain that because, that requires kind of talking about yourself in a way that's not really, I don't think that's something that in hindsight people can work out. But I can't expect others to achieve that level of whatever I believe I've clarity or whatever I think I've tried to achieve. So they've had their own journey. We're not, I hope that the future brings that back, but it's not just my son and my ex. It's also my other close members of my family, my brother, who again at the time was subscribed to those ideas. They've all moved on since, but often I think that, as is the case with the COVID debate, by the way, which is another part where again, it was all taken away from me when I started opposing the COVID mandates. But by that time, it wasn't my first rodeo. But as the case with the COVID debate is the same point. People forget why they don't like you. They adopt what you're saying many years later, but still hate you for saying it because they can't remember why they hated you in the first place. All they remember is that's not a good guy. So in the case of COVID, to give the analogy, he's a conspiracy theorist, or he's somebody that, basically is a bit too anti-establishment for us. So, but they can't remember. And then they may have eventually, as has happened with the COVID debate, all of them have adopted the idea that the vaccines didn't work, the lockdowns were a waste of time, that masks were theatre and distraction and a tool for compliance. They've all now adopted those ideas. Those at least that were most vocal in criticizing those that said these things have stopped criticizing them, but they still don't like those who said them. And the same's happened in the case of challenging the Islamist ideology. No Muslim publicly any longer advocates what we used to advocate in those days. But in those days, that was the default form of political expression that was coming from our community because the traditionalists were quietist, as most traditionalists are. And so in my case, I'm remembered primarily by those who have adopted the ideas that I struggled to popularize. I'm primarily remembered for being the troublemaker, both in the Islamist extremist debate and now in the COVID debate as well.
Wow. So leaving this idea, like I get the vision of it being almost like a mafia of some kind that you're not supposed to leave.
Yeah.
When you decide, I guess you're inside of jail having these debates, advancing your own perspective on things. Is there a certain point that you come to where like, I have to renounce this ideology, and then did you start to lay out a plan to do that, or was this a gradual thing? Like, what is the actual point of transformation for you?
In prison, it was gradual.
Okay.
But outside of prison, as I said, it took a year. But the point where I knew there was no return is the guy that recruited me was the leader of the group in Britain at the time. Yeah. His name was Nassim. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, "We want you to become the leader." Mm-hmm. And I said, let me think about it. And when I went back to him and I said, "I can't, I have to leave the group. I cannot do this because I no longer subscribe to this." Mm-hmm. And he asked me, he said, "Just give me a week to prepare the group because this is going to be a shock to everybody." Mm-hmm. I gave him that week and then announced it. But that was for me, that was the tipping point because I was forced to make a decision. I could have very easily chosen the leadership position, mm-hmm. but I try not to be a hypocrite. So I really couldn't do that.
So it was a matter of renouncing this idea of wanting to impose the faith. Right?
Yeah, I've always remained a Muslim.
Yes.
There is one key difference. When I left, I was see the word devout or practicing Muslim or religious Muslim, these are all arbitrary constructs because you also know that everyone's a sinner. So, sure. But I was somebody that used to try and adhere to the strictures and the rulings. And when the quote you just read, when all of that happened, and I was left pretty much stranded, and then coming into America under armed escort, it was a very hollowing out time, very stressful, and very you lose everything. Yeah. And so mentally and emotionally stressful. Mm-hmm. So I became very lapsed in my devotion because I'd been rejected by everybody. And I think that was me playing out some trauma. Yeah. But fast forward, this rodeo, this time around, it's been the opposite. I've actually found myself coming a lot closer to my faith tradition. I've found myself, in fact, returning to the levels of commitment that I had in terms of devotion when I was in the group, but minus the political and ideological baggage that I used to subscribe to. So now I'm very happy and proud to say I adhere to my 5 daily prayers, fast every day in Ramadan, and don't drink alcohol. And whereas the period this decade before, a lot of my personal devotion was lapsed, and that I think about a lot of that. It was there was too much for me. Yeah. To do, and I think something had to give, and my own emotional and I think emotional and let's say health, my focus on health and emotional stability is something that could have been a lot better. Mm-hmm.
The intervention by Amnesty International on your behalf, I believe in one of your interviews you described this as the first time you felt like you were actually receiving support from a Western institution.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And obviously they were advocating for freedom of speech ultimately, right? It's like the law that you were deposed for is just speech effectively, right? You were propagating bad ideas. Yeah.
It's in the charge.
Yeah.
Tarwij bil qawli wal kitab. It says propagation by speech and writing.
Yes.
That's what we were convicted for.
So did Amnesty International then, was that intervention something that helped change your views on Western values, or what role did that play in your transformation?
There's a very beautiful man who is currently, I think, in his early 90s. His name's John Cornwall. He was a local Buckingham Amnesty activist in the UK, Buckinghamshire. And he started and when I say local, so keep in mind, Amnesty is both a country-based organization and a global organization. So here's somebody from a local city chapter, not even on the national leadership. So this is a lowly in quotation marks, lowly activist in a neighborhood, on a neighborhood level. He started a letter writing campaign. And I suppose it had to start there because, peak of the war on terror, who's going to want to defend Muslims detained by Blair and Bush in Egypt and Mubarak, their ally? So he started a letter writing campaign. And somehow this man managed to eventually get Amnesty International globally to adopt us as prisoners of conscience. And it became a global amnesty campaign. Now, it didn't help us. It didn't help us as in it didn't get us out of prison early. We had to still complete our full sentence. But it did help us that it meant that I can now sit here 20 years later and say we were prisoners of conscience. We weren't charged nor accused of any violence. And as proof that we were prisoners of conscience, we were formally adopted so by Amnesty International. And that's very, very helpful. And it was all down to this man, John Cornwall. So he and I became pen pals while I was in prison. And he's somebody that till this day has been a observant Christian, but on the liberal end of the Christian tradition, Church of England. When I say liberal end, he's still very much like, and I know there's a big debate in Christianity, but he's still very much pro gay rights and making sure that homosexuals and the LGB part of the alphabet soup that eventually it became, but the old school version of that. So just making sure that that Christians aren't discriminating against people that are gay. So he's on the liberal end of Church of England kind of, but he did a lot and we became firm friends. In fact, there's a 3-minute Channel 4 film about our relationship because that was really the opening for me. It was that human relationship. He used to write to me letters and I'm sitting in this bare concrete jail cell getting these letters from this guy at the time was in his 70s or whatever. We had, other than that, nothing in common. And we're exchanging these letters. He managed to get Amnesty to adopt us. Now, keep in mind, up until that point, my experience with authority had been defined by what I told you, that story. Yeah. So I had been falsely arrested at the age of 15 at gunpoint. Right. These were like semi-automatic weapons that had been pointed at our heads for a false accusation of armed robbery because my 16-year-old brother and I were playing in a park with a plastic pellet gun, and somebody thought that means we were about to rob a bank. And this is before terrorism was ever a problem with Muslims. In fact, terrorism in those days was a problem for the IRA, the Irish Republican terrorism. So somebody just profiled us and decided we must have been about to rob a bank. But my relationship with authorities had been defined by, that's the police there for you. That's not the only time I was arrested. I've been arrested many times as a teenager. But then you had the Bosnia genocide, and then you had these racist attacks with machetes and hammers. And then Tony Blair is prime minister and is invading Iraq. I can't describe just how oppositional I felt with the world. Like this was like, we were enemies. Yeah. And the thought in that concept came with John Cornwall and then Amnesty International's campaign for us. And that's where I've mentioned in my autobiography, Radical, I've mentioned that where the heart leads, the mind can follow. So I had to have a softening of the heart first before I could start unraveling some of these ideological ideas that I'd subscribed to. And Amnesty's outreach was where the heart began to soften and the mind could follow after that.
And before that, before your heart softening, I think you said you were primarily motivated by anger. Yeah. Up until that point.
Yeah. And a desire for vengeance and justice.
And a desire for vengeance and justice towards the West in general. Okay. This is something I've struggled with a lot too. Like, anger is one of those ambivalent things, right? It's, I think I've heard Peterson talk about this. It can invoke both positive and negative emotions, whereas most of the other moods are pretty strongly affective one way or the other. What is the role of anger in your story? Like, it sounds like it was part of your radicalization at least, but then in getting through kind of the Reformation and you embracing Western values, how has your relationship with anger changed over time?
So anger was key to radicalization. It still is. If you want to radicalize somebody, you do need to get them angry. And as you correctly pointed out, because what it does is it's anger on behalf of people you love. Right. So it's not hate. Yeah. It's very important to understand that distinction. Yeah. Because you only get angry if you care about something. And we were angry because we were, whether it was the Bosnian Muslims or by that time, a lot of the other conflicts had also begun to spark. So Afghanistan, Chechnya, Kashmir, Palestine. We were angry on behalf of fellow Muslims that we thought were under attack all over the world. That's partially correct. The partial incorrect part of it is that they were under attack not just because of their faith tradition, but actually it was more to do with the dynamics of colonialism, empire, economic exploitation. But we were framing it in one particular ideological lens. But that anger was key because you have to be able to be angry on behalf of people to be then angry at those that you believe have done something to those people. In terms of me going through a change of heart and what have you. As I say, the softening of the heart was crucial. But also what that did, and I think that in the US introduction to my book, I've written about my reflections post coming to America. In fact, the preface is called Coming to America, and it mentions meeting my wife in there as well eventually. But I think that to be able to, when you're angry on behalf of some people, to be able to not hate those that you think you're angry at for doing it to those people, you have to be able to humanize. And the rehumanization is a key element there that comes with human contact. You can't rehumanize a people that you've demonized unless you have that human contact.
Right.
And John Cornwell was the first example of that. But then, of course, the more I started trusting that feeling that I felt that John and I had, the more I trusted in that and carried forward with that, the more I have contact with other people that I began to humanize. And eventually, of course, our child is born, obviously, to me, and an American born and raised in Tennessee who's been raised Catholic. So the ultimate, the end path of that journey was a child born to both traditions or both communities.
And is anger still a motivational force for you in what you do now?
Yeah, I mean,
Can it be channeled positively?
yeah,
I guess,
absolutely.
Yeah.
It can be. Well, it's not. It's. I don't think it's human not to feel these emotions.
Sure.
I think the key thing is to feel them, but channel them, as you've said, and that requires spiritual grounding. It requires spiritual teachers that are connected by word of mouth to tradition. It's not something you can learn in books. You can't learn to swim from a book. You can't learn MMA from a book,
Right.
And you can't learn the spiritual basis for tranquility from reading a book. It's not something you have to. It's something you have to train, just like physical training.
Yes. Well, you're touching on. I'm a huge fan of Musashi. And he often says that.
Yeah.
In his book of 5 Rings, he'll describe a lot of things you need to do, but then he says you can't learn this by reading.
No.
Right? The way is in training. He repeats that over and over and over again.
Yeah. In Islamic communities, they think they can learn the tradition by reading books, because what did this, and this is what I was speaking about with Jordan, is the invention of the printing press has many positives. But one of the negatives is this tendency to think that we can self-teach, because the Bible became for the first time accessible to the masses.
Right.
Likewise, by the way, the Quran and so the same consequences in the Islamic tradition. The rich history of Islamic literature and theology and history and all of that, those books were not mass published.
Right.
And they were never meant to be mass consumed.
Right.
Their purpose was never for a mass audience.
Yeah.
These were debates scholars were having with each other on perhaps 10, 20, 30 years of precedence in their own debates. Right. So there's a book, for example, Tahafut al-Falasifa and Tahafut al-Tahafut. Now, these are two books, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and Tahafut al-Tahafut, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, is a refutation of the first one. This is actually a real-life example of two books, Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, known in the West as Averroes, because he's also a famous philosopher for Western philosophers as well. This Averroes was from the period of Islamic Spain, by the way. Now, these two scholars, giants in the Islamic tradition, giants. I mean, I've got both of these books at home, and I cannot overemphasize how these men were giants in their tradition. These are we're talking of leaders in their fields. And they're writing these books, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and The Incoherence of the Incoherence is attempted refutation of that. These two scholars, they are, if you just look at, those two books themselves are quite short, by the way, but they've written compendiums of knowledge. People think that today, because we've got access to these books, we can read this and understand it. But the problem is, before writing these two books, these two both have written books that fill entire shelves. And those books they've written, they're filling entire shelves today because it's printed material. Imagine that was handwritten scribes, because that's how they were written. It would be more than a shelf, because of course printing, it kind of shortens the length of the book because it's more succinct. But these are, and how they would write these is they would dictate them to their scribes. So it was from memory.
Wow.
That's how people used to write books before the printing press, right? Because of course there weren't books. So you'd have to memorize, and then you'd have a scribe, and you'd have the scribe class. There was an entire, like civil servants or bureaucrats that work in Washington, D.C. now, and all they ever do is pen push. There was literally a pen pushing class of people. They were called al-Kuttab in Arabic, or scribes. And their employ was you'd pay them like mercenaries, and they'd write down literally what you said. So emperors would have them in courts, and scholars would have them. And they'd sit there on the floor, and this is where the idea of the chair comes from. The chair of a university, the chair of a company, because it comes from the scholar in Egypt at the first university in the world, Al-Azhar, founded by the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. And that scholar would sit in Al-Azhar Mosque, in the Masjid of Al-Azhar in Egypt, and he'd sit on a chair in a corner, which is where the department comes from, because he'd be in a corner of the mosque under a pillar, and he'd be on a chair. So the chair of the department comes from that. He'd be sat on that chair, and he'd be dictating to the scribe, who'd be sat there writing everything he's saying. And they would write encyclopedias of knowledge from memory in this way. Now, we think today that by reading these books in print, we're going to understand this and debate this. It is a folly. It's a fallacy. And it's born of arrogance. I cannot overemphasize how much we need a living teacher who is a manifestation of that faith tradition as a living organism.
Yes.
It's incredibly important.
Yeah, the participatory element or the communal element has fallen away with this one-to-one access.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that I discovered you originally on the Rogan podcast, and I think it was shortly thereafter I started following you on Twitter. And you had this tweet pinned to your profile for some time. And I thought it was one of the best descriptions of the nature of human society, human psychology, something like that. And I'd like to read it. It's a 6-point tweet. And you wrote that the struggles between powerful vested interests over how the rest of us view reality are constant. Point 2, this means that information wars are constant and we are the subjects. Number 3, so we are permanently in a state of both hybrid war and hybrid peace over how to view reality. Number 4, hence permanent propaganda is either normalized and we simply forget seeking truth, i.e. Orwell's 1984, or we insist on filtering propaganda in principle and aspire to justice, which relies on seeking truth. 5. Therefore, we are at a crossroads. Allow centralized sources of information to define reality for us, or encourage decentralized sources of information so that truth and hence justice may emerge. Finally, 6. The type of future we aspire to depends on it. Closed, exploited, and uncritical, which is centralized, or open, humane, and free, which is decentralized.
Yeah.
Could you just, I think it's a pretty brilliant summary of kind of the nature of existing in the human paradigm, right? The way I've described this in the past is the realization that the cognitive flexibility that we have as humans, or the programmability, if you will, is our superpower, right? We can adapt to reality in ways that no other animal can. We can communicate at a scale no other animal can. Yuval Harari says we can cooperate flexibly in large numbers, which makes us the animal that's the top of the food chain. But that same advantage, our cognitive flexibility or programmability, can also be wielded against us, right? If you don't understand the nature of human cognition, then you might end up being programmed inside of a PSYOP or on the wrong side of an information warfare, as you might describe it. This seems to be like one of the most important things humans could realize about themselves, now more so than ever. So how do you, unpack this, and how do you try and talk about this thing that's almost inherently difficult to talk about because we're always inside of the language in which we're trying to describe the war itself.
Yeah, language is inherently limited.
Yes.
I went into some of this again in my conversation with Jordan Peterson, the limiting nature of language. So just imagine what the printing press that we've just discussed did to the way in which we ended up being stuck in our own heads. The original version of the printing press was the invention of language itself.
Yeah.
Because prior to the invention of language, we would have had a very instinctive relationship with each other. Language ended up turning that instinctive relationship with those that we were born among into a more abstract relationship. And of course, that's when you end up in imagination. And then you get the printing press. It takes that a step further. Now the internet's taken it a step further to a point of virtual reality. So you can see how we end up getting stuck in our own heads. But even in between those stages, between the invention of language and the invention of writing prior to the printing press, where language was a oral tradition, it was still a much more visceral relationship with our surroundings, because it was a matter of life and death if I could describe the path to water in a desert, which is what, by the way, the word Sharia means path to water. That's all it means. Path to life, path to water. But it would be a matter of death for a Bedouin in the desert to be able to tell you the difference between left and right. It literally would be a matter of life and death to know what a woman is, because you would not be able to reproduce, and your entire tribe would die. Today, this is an abstract and almost farcical conversation. But you can see how prior to even the written word, in the oral tradition, words would point you to life and death realities. And so your relationship with language would have been a lot more important. So the purpose of language, as I say, is to describe reality. Now to the quote that you've just read, one of the things I've said is that if we can no longer agree over what reality is, then we can no longer agree on a common basis to solve our disputes. And in that context, if we can no longer agree as to what reality is, the only thing that matters is power, because power gets to define reality based upon its own arbitrary parameters, if there is no such thing as reality.
Right.
So then, of course, if the only thing that matters is power, you can see how everything becomes about the struggle to gain that power. And all the injustices that are then committed, because they're not injustices if there's no such thing as reality.
Right. You
can't even define them as injustice.
Right.
So that's where the current assault on reality comes in. Whenever you want to change a society, you have to begin by convincing your target audience that everything they have come to hold to believe is true isn't true. Because you can't mold something anew if people are still holding on to a sense of reality from the old. You have to first convince them that none of that's true, therefore it's not reality, so that they are completely pliable. And if you have power, you can then move them to what you want your new sense of reality to become. So in a sense, everything we see around us and take us for true is a manifestation of collective consciousness. The collective consciousness of human beings defines reality.
Right.
And without the collective consciousness of human beings, we wouldn't have reality. So then the real, I think, question from what you read there comes as to how you try and seek truth, how you define reality. And this touches on my belief that what you just read is one of the fundamental flaws in atheism. And I've got many, many friends. Famously, I have a dialogue with one of the leading new atheist thinkers, Sam Harris. It became a book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which became a documentary on Amazon Prime by the same name. And I've said it to them, and I'll say it again here, because if you think of what it means to be Lord of everything that exists, or the source of all life. And I don't want anyone to think of this as some form of grandfather in the sky because that in itself is, I believe, something that came about through the political intervention of the Roman Empire at the Council of Nicaea, where they adopted official Christianity as dogma and got to define what Christianity is today, including the image of white Jesus. All of that these were all political decisions. So let's disregard all of that, and so that nobody thinks I'm picking on Christianity. The same can be said for Islam in Saudi Arabia. It is a direct result of the power politics that played out post-Ottoman Empire with Lawrence of Arabia and what's known as the Ali Saud dynasty, who adopted the dogma of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, which became the official state dogma of Saudi Arabia. What we think of as Islam today and what we think of as Christianity today are direct byproducts of what we have been taught by those who won the clash of narratives because they had power. In the case of Christianity, as I say, it was all formally adopted at the Council of Nicaea to keep the Roman Empire going. And they decided pragmatically Christianity was the best way to do that because you could have one God, one people, one empire, which is what the Saudi Wahhabi version also aspires to, is what the Islamists, a direct byproduct of this thinking, were also seeking to do. One God, one people, one empire. But actually, so that's not what I mean by my critique of atheism. Religion for me is part of the problem. What I'm talking about is if you don't have a sense of a source of life or a fundamental life force that exists in all of us, that exists independent of us, but we are of it. If you don't have that, you have nothing to aspire to that is above and beyond or extra to reality to try and seek out and attain. If the only thing that matters is the material world around you, and the material world is constantly changing, and there is no eternal truth, then of course reality is constantly changing. And there's no permanent reality.
This is the descent into relativism.
Yeah. And I believe atheism, in its pure intellectual sense, cannot avoid that logical conclusion. That if everything is a constant... If everything is material and matter is simply evolving from one state to another, then what's real?
Right.
Whereas if you've got a sense of a permanence in a life force that exists independent of matter, if you think of ourselves as a manifestation of consciousness in merely one form, but that consciousness is permanent. What I said with Jordan on his podcast, if you think of a spherical ball, and imagine, to go into a bit more detail than I did on the Peterson conversation, imagine that spherical ball has a light inside it, but you've covered that sphere with a black tissue paper. And then you take a pin and you pierce holes on the surface of that sphere, equally spaced holes all around the sphere. What's going to happen is the light's going to shine through those holes, and the tissue paper is going to cover the bits where the holes aren't, but you're going to see light coming through those holes. Now, each one of those holes is an analogy for the individual. The individual is actually an empty space. Our human body is an empty vessel. What we actually are is the light emanating from it. And if you think of it in that way, it's the same light that's in the middle of that sphere. All of us are manifesting that very same light. And your form and my form is a hole in the surface of that sphere. If you think of it that way, then there is a permanent life force, source, eternal energy, Allah, which I use deliberately and not God, because again, the word God comes with that baggage of the Council of Nicaea and the grandfather in the sky and the patriarchal hegemony imposed from top, which is part of the problem, by the way. With the Islamists, with Christianity, same problem. And it's the idea that, you have to have imposition and empire. Whereas what we're talking of is something organic that grows from within all life, like the mycelial network that is known to exist among trees underground, and they communicate with each other, and they look like individual trees, but actually what we've now since discovered is that tree even feeds its child through that mycelial network underground. We know that plants communicate through that mycelial network. We're all, if you think of it, we're all like that. So if
we often say this in Bitcoin, that we're all each a node on the network. So those trees are nodes on a much larger organism that is the mycelial network.
And so if you think of it in that way, then there is something to aspire to that exists beyond the material element or matter. And in fact, truthfully, perhaps we're not even that, because we're the whole that emanates the light, and the whole isn't the real part. The light is the real part.
Yeah.
So that, I believe, gives meaning to the idea of seeking truth. Now, I don't want to say we know the truth, because again, that's part of the problem, that we think we know the truth. So it's why I phrase it as the search for truth. And it's the search for truth that is the most important thing, because it's the belief that there is a truth. But ultimately, is why I began by saying, what does it mean to be Lord of all that exists? What does it mean to be that source of all life? Is because only if you agree that matter in a constant change of flux, by definition, if it's constantly changing, that means reality is constantly changing. That means, in that extreme sense, the only thing that is real is that eternal life force. And everything else is a temporary state of manifestation from that eternal life force. And in the scheme of things, we're infinitesimal when it comes to that sense of eternal. And so what it means to be Lord of all that exists, Rabbul Alameen, we say in Arabic, or the source of all life, or Allah, is to be reality. Which is why one of the 99 names of Allah, one of the 99 attributes, Allah has 99 attributes, Al-Haq, right, is simply reality. That's one. If I said to you today, I worship reality in Arabic, I'd literally be saying I worship Allah. There's no distinction. If I said to you, this is going to freak some people out, another name of Allah, or attribute, depending on how you translate it, is Al-Mumit, the death giver. If I say to you, I worship death, right, I'd literally be saying I worship Allah in Arabic, if I spoke in Arabic. So these things can get very easily lost in translation. But any Arabic, if I said I'm Abdul Mumit, I'm servant of the death giver, you're going to think I'm worshipping the devil. But no, that's one of Allah's attributes.
Because it's an aspect of reality.
Yeah. Because the only one that can give death is the one that gave life. You're talking of the same thing. Another attribute, by the way, is also the life giver, right? And so, yuhyi wa yumit is a passage in the Quran. He who gives life and he who gives death. Only he, right? So another name is Abdul. So it's Yahya to give life, right? So Abdul is the prefix, so servant of, or the one who worships that thing. So you can be Mumit, you can be what did we say? Reality. Haq. Abdul Haq is another name. Servant of reality. Actually, you're servant of Allah. Now, this is weird in translation. It doesn't make sense in English, but that's where it's all lost in translation. So back to the point. If you realize the only reality in this sense is the one, and everything else is a temporary manifestation of that same life force, and is going to disappear one day, and we're all going to return to that one life force. If you think of it like that, then when you're seeking truth, you're seeking oneness with that life force. And it's a pursuit, it's a search, it's a quest. And we can try and get as close to that as possible. And so it becomes important to recognize that the search for truth is a spiritual quest primarily. But there's no distinction when you look at it like this between science and spirituality either.
Yes.
Because on that quantum level, they're one and the same thing. And modern kind of quantum conversations really have arrived at this, but ancient Eastern mystical conversations arrived at this a long time ago. So, whereas, back to that statement. That's why I believe that during the COVID psychological assault on our senses perpetrated by some of the most powerful governments on the planet in synchronicity with each other, a psychological attack on the human being, during that period where they attempted to convince us that black was white and white was black, which, again, Orwell eerily predicted in 1984, where they attempted, and still are, attempting to convince us that man is woman and woman is man. Those that had that sense of seeking oneness with the eternal life force, with Allah, were, I believe, more resilient against that psychological attack. Because if you don't have your Rabbul Alameen, or your Lord of all that exists, which is the kind of, again, it's a difficult translation, but Al-Alameen is like Lord of all the universes. We've always had this idea that there isn't just one reality. I say we, the Muslim tradition and Eastern mystical traditions generally, have always had this idea that what we see now is merely but one facet of reality. And scientifically, we know that our eyesight, in terms of the spectrum of vision that we see, and our hearing and what we hear, right now we think the only noise in this room is my voice and you humming or agreeing as I speak, whatever. Absolutely not. All you need to do is twist the dial of a radio. There's 1 million music songs playing right now in this room that you need an aerial and a radio to tune into, and then that speaker blasts them out because it's a receiver. But they're all here. They're literally floating around. You just put a battery in a radio and you pick them up.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they're not here. Or infrared vision. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can't see. It's just our eyes can't pick them up. So we've always had this sense there's more than one reality here. But the Lord of all of those realities, Rabbul Alameen, if you don't have that concept, you can't, what it means is that you will vest, because there's no basis for defining reality, you will vest the ability to define reality into the next most powerful thing. Because as we said, if you can't define reality, the only thing that matters is power, because power gets to define reality for you through telling you narratives it controls.
Right.
So if you don't have a sense of Rabbul Alameen, or Lord of all that exists, all life, all universes, then the next most powerful thing is the state. I don't think there's anything more powerful outside of that. Certainly you could bring me the strongest man on the planet, not as powerful as a state.
Yeah.
So the problem becomes that the state then, it gets to define reality. And of course, who runs the state? So what you end up becoming is, and this brings us even to the Islamic concept of why it's such I'd say a vehemently monotheistic faith tradition. Because we say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدْ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدْ, say Allah is one. Because the problem here is you end up, if the state gets to define your reality for you, you end up worshipping the state. And I mean the word worship there in its truest sense. Your sense of reality gets to be defined by the state. So everything you are, everything you think is worthy of pursuing, everything you think is a good value and a bad value, your very sense of self ends up being defined by something other people have created. So you're no longer worshipping Rabbul Alameen, or, the master of all universes, or the source of all life. You end up basically worshipping that man-made entity called the state, and they get to define for you what's important, what's not important. Now, whether that's the industrial schooling complex, whether that's in the case of medical complex, or you can see where this ends. So we end up thinking that good and bad, or very, existence and non-existence itself can be defined by this thing. And so now we're surprised we're in absurd debates about what a woman is, what a man is, when we're allowing for those definitions and those conversations to be led by the state and by what it wants to achieve for its own ends with human beings. I don't really, so I'd say to everybody, actually, not just me, I'd say to everybody, if you don't pay attention to that, if you don't allow for that to penetrate your thinking, it has no power over you. And so back to your observation, where those that existed who did have a sense of Rabbul Alameen, or Lord of all that exists, they were less susceptible to being influenced by the PSYOP, or the psychological operation that was the COVID mandate period. And so you found an interesting correlation between those that said that their sense of reality came from their quest to seek truth with the only version of truth that is infinite, and that is the source of all life. It's harder to try and infiltrate their thoughts, those people.
That makes a lot of sense. So the state as a monopoly on violence or force perhaps is even intentionally trying to degenerate the conversation by attacking definitions or language, such that maybe an independent or critical eye in the pursuit of truth is unavailable, so that then power gets to define truth.
It is now doing that. It's intentionally attacking it. Why? Whereas it wasn't, it was incrementally 10 years ago, but now it's come to the fore.
Yeah.
Why? Because the states realize that the illusion that it's founded on is crumbling.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Wasabi Wallet. With Wasabi Wallet, you can receive, send, and store Bitcoin privately. In Wasabi Wallet, your transaction history and wallet balance are completely hidden. Wasabi Wallet is easy to use, all of its privacy features are built in by default, and it works with any amount of Bitcoin. Wasabi users can make CoinJoin transactions together with BTC Pay server users or Trezor Suite users. For BTC Pay server users, they can make payments directly inside of a CoinJoin, and for Trezor Suite users, you can make CoinJoins directly on a hardware wallet. These features result in fee savings and security improvements for both sets of users. So go to wasabiwallet.io today to download the state-of-the-art Bitcoin privacy wallet. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Casa. Casa makes it simple to buy and secure your Bitcoin without wondering whether you're doing it right. Specifically, Casa provides a multi-key custody solution, which is by far the most secure way to custody your Bitcoin. Now, when I talk about Bitcoin being theft-proof money or inviolable private property, a multi-key custody model is exactly what I am talking about. Using multiple keys lets you maintain full control of your Bitcoin while also giving you redundancy in case you lose one of the keys. It's also the best way to secure your Bitcoin for inheritance planning purposes. So go to keys.casa, that's C-A-S-A, today to sign up and use discount code BREEDLOVE. That crumbling, is that because we're in a new technological paradigm?
Yeah. So if you go back to the Rogan interview, what I said is that the invention of the printing press led to the 30 Years' War in Europe. Because, of course, once you democratized access to information, people got access to the Bible for the first time. And with all the cons that come with self-taught religion, one of the things they did realize is that they were being exploited by the church. And things like favors were being sold.
Indulgences, right?
Indulgences.
Yeah.
And so what you ended up with, the 30 Years' War and the rebalancing of power between the church, the state, and the people. Now, the internet has done a very similar thing. So originally writing did that. Then the printing press did that. We're in that moment now with the internet.
Yeah.
We didn't realize it because, of course, we're the proverbial boiling frog in water. We've been, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 45.
37.
Right. So I remember a time before the internet.
Yeah, me too.
And I remember a time before mobile phones. Certainly remember a time before YouTube and definitely remember a time before Twitter.
Yeah.
Whereas, my son will never. My 6-year-old son. Nor will my 22-year-old. The kind of impact that technology has on us, we will not know until much later on. But the decisions we make now are going to disproportionately affect the future of humanity in a way that the decisions they made when the printing press came about affected us. And if you look at that situation, it's why I say that actually right now the state recognizing that it's losing its grip on that illusion that it had to maintain its power, it's acting desperate, and it's going to try and create a new illusion to keep up with people who have lost faith in the old illusion and are creating their own new illusions for themselves.
Right.
and they'll flood the zone. They're flooding the zone with information. Part of that is you're going to start, the proliferation of debates like whether the earth is flat or round, or whether the people doing this to us all are actually literally reptiles, literally lizards, or are just uncompassionate human beings.
Right.
Whether a woman is a man. Yeah. These absurd debates, and I say absurd, doesn't mean they're wrong or right. They're just absurd, right? The zone needs to be flooded with them so that no one can argue. I could sit here right now and give you a 2-hour lecture on why the earth is flat. I can actually do it. I could also give you a 2-hour lecture as to why they are actually lizards. And I could give you a 2-hour lecture as to why, what else did we just, the third example we just gave. But the point being, that if you, to get people to move, you have to destroy the reality from under their feet.
Right.
And that's where we are. And now either we succumb to that, to the establishment's attempt at steering us to their new reality, and then our children will then again assume where we land, they'll then assume that's reality until the next time this is done to us. Or, and that was back to the quote you read, and even if it's 2 blocks, as Orwell explained, with the Eurasia and the Oceania in Orwell's 1984, it's still permanent. You can't, because the other problem is that, it's 2 blocks in the planet and they're both fighting over whose narrative is true. But there's the individual in that context is absolutely powerless, which was the point of the book, 1984. Yes. So I see, back to what you read there from my post, I see the only way out of that, because technology and bureaucracies will always err towards centralization. The more technology is an efficient way to do things. The more government acquires efficiencies, the more centralized it will become.
Sure.
And that's just how bureaucracies work.
So is the role then of religion or spirituality, is it indispensable to resisting this centralization and control over narrative, that people need to believe in something that is outside of the sphere of government, something that is agnostic to human affairs, some absolute, I guess?
If there's no Allah, the king is Allah. I believe it's essential, yeah. If there's no Allah to define, to aspire towards for the sense of truth.
Yes.
And remember, I'm saying Allah is truth and reality and life and death, all of those things. Yeah. If there is no that thing to aspire to, then the king becomes that thing for everybody.
I've heard this put that if you start confusing the principle of sovereignty with an individual sovereign, that's the beginning of the end for a society, right? When you vest absolute power into an individual.
And this was the revolution that Muhammad, upon him be peace, brought to the Arabian desert, in the sense that he said, look, forget these idols that you think have power over you. And of course, whoever controlled the house in which these idols were and the offerings that were given to them, there was a whole economy around it. And the Kaaba in Mecca was the center of this trade route between the Romans and the Persians who were crossing these deserts. And so it became an economic foundation around this kind of these idols and this sense of power being vested in these things, and therefore in whoever controlled these things. So along comes Muhammad and says, you don't need any of this. You're sovereign. You have a direct relationship with the source. So your sense of self has to exist outside of any of these structures. And it exists between you and all life around you, because you are all life around you, and all life around you is you. That was a very revolutionary concept. And I think that I believe it was the same thing Jesus was saying. I believe it's the same thing Moses was saying. And that's why we think it's the same thing throughout the Abrahamic faith traditions. But that's what empire sought to appropriate. I often say everything is appropriation. Emperors realized the revolutionary power of that concept. So they appropriated it and conflated it with this man in the sky concept, because that's the dominion you need as an emperor to then have empire. You need to have this idea that it's a relationship that that is hierarchical, that has this kind of that has this it emphasizes hierarchical power structures to control your dominion and your empire, which is very different to saying, I don't need any of that. I don't need government. That's where I stand. I don't need any of that to have this direct relationship, a sense of self, and therefore a sense of reality. Which is why during COVID, people often, they're like, wasn't that hard, Maajid? The time I did that Rogan interview, it was not just blasphemous. That's putting it mildly. What I said was too controversial for the Rogan show. People often forget that episode.
It was censored, right?
For 3 weeks.
Yeah.
It was completely taken. It wasn't. I had to put out videos online on Twitter before now I'm very heavily shadow banned on Twitter as well. At the time, I wasn't so shadow banned. Basically, directly addressing Eck. What's his name? The Spotify CEO, Daniel.
I'm not sure. But Spotify was the one censoring the Joe Rogan episodes.
Spotify censored it for 3 weeks, and I said, you claimed that you were upset with Rogan because he hadn't had enough. In his own words, ethnic minority voices, we're going to give more platforms now to marginalized voices. I'm like, your very next episode was mine. You can't, this is what I find absurd with this woke, honestly, it's just pandering, right? It's virtuously. If you wanted to write a story with all the check boxes of whatever the woke narrative of victimhood is, my story would fit. It's up there with, whether it's imprisoned in the war on terror, face racist violence, whatever you want to say, racism and discrimination, and yet you censor my episode. So it was at the time, I'd just been sacked. I'd lost my career. I had a radio show on the UK's largest commercial radio network. So it wasn't just a job I lost, by the way, as I'm sure people in this room can empathize with. It was a career that they took from me, because no one in that world is going to hire me again. I'm now the conspiracy theorist. So at the time it was, they took my career from me, and then I eventually get on Rogan because I'd already known Rogan through the Sam Harris conversations, and I'd been on his show once because of that. I managed to get on Rogan, and then Spotify tries to hold that back. So think of the time. The time, I often say, it was like, it's difficult to describe now because these ideas are becoming normalized, but it was deemed insane to say half this stuff on Rogan. But it's all been verified now. It's all come out to be true.
Yeah, and we're still seeing censorship around it. We were hit on this show a few weeks ago for medical misinformation just for talking about some of this topic. So you mentioned appropriation.
Yeah.
It has occurred to me, and this is just me hypothesizing, that perhaps this wokeism narrative that we see, it seems to have appropriated certain features from things like the civil rights movement, and it's tried to apply them to this narrative or PSYOP to make it seem more legitimate, whereas in reality it seems to be taking people down that very path you described, like away from any type of moral absolute into this realm of pure relativism. Such that, power reigns effectively, right? There is no absolute truth. Everything's relative. Therefore, power is the ultimate arbiter of truth, I suppose. How do you now other people?
By the way, sorry to cut you, because the ultimate conclusion there is, if power reigns, the ultimate conclusion there is the narcissistic individual is all that matters. Right. Because at the extreme level, if power reigns, then you are acquiring that power to reign. Right. Yeah. So the only thing that matters is the narcissistic individual. You can see from there how you end up with, I self-identify as a rhinoceros.
Yes. And then using the force of coercion or law then to compel people to play pretend with you if you identify as a rhinoceros or whatever else. What is that, I guess, an accurate way to look at it, that the state is trying to adapt to these revolutionary moves against it and appropriating things from, say, the civil rights movement and applying them to wokeism to make this seem as like a legitimate social concern, whereas the reality seems to be it's another one of those
idealism that's being funded to cover up theft.
It's doing it as we speak. Look, I'm not going to, can I not pull any punches?
Please.
Yeah? Look, Elon Musk and Twitter and his purchase of Twitter and DeSantis and Elon appointing a director of the World Economic Forum as his new CEO for Twitter. All of this is the establishment reacting to the kind of thing we said on the Rogan episode. It's not just me, that everyone who, people in this room and others who subscribe to this critical view have been saying. They are trying desperately to keep up. And I've been open and vocal about this, about Elon Musk from day one, while people, again, at the time criticizing me for saying that, we've got to treat Elon Musk with the skepticism that somebody that has multiple Defense Department contracts that runs the US space defense program, and you think this is a man of the people. He's the richest published billionaire on the planet. Now, he does good things and bad things like all of us. Yeah. So I give credit where credit is due. Twitter is probably a nicer place for most people since he purchased it. Not for me, because I'm still heavily shadow banned. And the reason is because I'm still warning about the appropriation of this message by people that have realized that they need to accelerate the decline because they've lost the argument. Now, if you've got the world's richest published man, owner of multiple defense contracts, runner of the US space defense program, effectively, owner of the world's most powerful communications weapon, which is Twitter, and owner of the world's most advanced electric transportation company, pretending that he has a vested interest in decentralization while telling us at the same time that he wants to create the everything app, X, which is what Twitter's official name now is, and wants to synchronize Neuralink or brain chips implanted into our brain with all of his other technologies to have this everything app, and models it along the Chinese app that does everything with the social credit score, has told us all of these things. Now, why do people tell you all these things, by the way? People say, people use the language in the following sense. They say, part of the occult is they have to tell you what they're doing. Otherwise, they lose the karma.
Yes.
This is a mystical explanation for it. The truth is, I'll just give you the reality. Everything we've just discussed. You can't create illusions if you don't cast spells. Spells are spelling, they're words. You won't believe that that's a nice chair unless, you are able to articulate for somebody else, it's a nice chair. Then you convince them it's a nice chair by articulating. So language is spells. Now, to be able to convince us that you're doing the right thing, you have to tell us what you're doing and package it as a nice thing. So of course they have to tell us what they're doing. That's how they convince us of the illusion. The only thing they have is language. I can't force you to think something because I can't get into your head until I create the Neuralink, right? To make you think something, I have to convince you, which means I have to tell you what I'm doing and convince you it's a good thing. So put aside the mystical explanation that they have to, the occult has to tell us what they're doing. They have to declare their hand because otherwise they suffer bad karma. The truth is, no, otherwise they can't conjure the illusion. So it's obvious they have to tell us what you're doing. So take it at face value. Look at what they're telling us. When on Rogan, I said, look, Klaus Schwab is telling us that he's penetrated the cabinets of the world, and he used Macron and Trudeau as an example. He's telling us that because he has to sustain the illusion that their presence in these cabinets is a good thing, and therefore the Young Leaders Program of the World Economic Forum is a good thing, because to convince us that it's a good thing means we continue supporting it, funding it, giving it that kind of prestige. That's all part of sustaining that illusion. So Musk comes along and tells us he wants to create the everything app. He's telling us all these things, so we end up defending Musk when he's creating the everything app. If he hadn't told us, we'd have nothing to defend when he's criticized.
We'd probably be skeptical if he hadn't told us.
Now that's the thing, is we have to therefore realize that on the point of appropriation that you've just met, it's happening as we speak. Musk appointing a World Economic Forum director as CEO of Twitter, while himself being who I've just described, wanting to create the everything app. He just went to China and spoke to Xi. Before that, he was in France speaking to Macron. DeSantis, who implemented lockdowns, who is a former Guantanamo Bay Navy lawyer. Allegations abound around interrogation under, torturous conditions in Guantanamo. All of this is because it's been very quickly realized that they have to become the opposition because they've lost the debate. The way to tell, though, is when these arguments are appropriated, then one of the key things you're gonna see is that voices that don't subscribe while saying the same thing aren't promoted, are still shadow banned. But voices that say these things without criticizing these key voices are actively promoted on Twitter. So you'll find that everything that was now said in that Rogan podcast, I mean, including things like Twitter is a psychological operations weapon, right? Naming the individuals that were Twitter staff that were actually doubling up not only as Twitter staff, but also as agents of the security state. All of this was revealed on Rogan, by the way, on my Rogan episode. All of this now is being actively allowed on Twitter, but the one that said it is still being shadow banned. So that's where you can start looking at this and realizing what's going on here. Arguments are being appropriated while the individuals that initially push them are being marginalized, because that's what you need to do when you appropriate an argument. Then you can steer it. If you've got everybody on Twitter thinking Elon Musk is the savior of the universe, when he creates the Everything app, it's a lot easier to create that buy-in. If you've owned the audience that would originally have been skeptical of you doing that thing, but now you're their savior. And I find it really absurd that people that think they're anti-globalist, anti-establishment are blindly hurtling towards this direction, endorsing a man as their savior who is telling them that he's going to create an app that in the end does everything for them, locks them into this system. He's already implemented the fact that you can't get this blue check anymore without subscribing to the system, giving him your digital ID, your financial data. He's telling us he wants to synchronize that with everything else, and you end up with the Chinese social credit system. He's told us he's modeled it on that. What's that Chinese app called? Weibo, or what is it? WeChat.
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 Yeah.
There's video of him saying WeChat is awesome, and I want Twitter to become WeChat. He's on video saying that. My Substack, it's called Radical Media, maajidnawaz.substack.com. The last article I published on Elon Musk has that video. I can't embed it anymore because Musk's at war with Substack, so you can't even embed tweets anymore in there. But I've got it as a screen grab. You click through, you'll see the video, and he's like, "Yeah, let's make Twitter WeChat." WeChat, the Chinese app, is the Chinese everything app. You like that Black Mirror episode. If there are undesirables in your zone, it gives you points for moving away from them.
Yes.
This is the app he's aspiring to, and people think he's the savior of the anti-globalist message. So this is a classic case of appropriation of the message.
Yes.
Now, he's done good things. He's not Satan. I'm going to temper this criticism by saying that, he's done good things as well. But I think it's important to always remain skeptical and critical of power, not to become sycophants for wealth and power just because they start saying things that we like to hear.
Yeah, because there's the possibility that he could be developing rapport with people, right? Such that he introduces this thing that's actually dystopian, but he presents it as something that's a solution.
Yeah. I mean, why appoint a director of the World Economic Forum as you're the world's richest published man, right? You have the choice of the planet. Anyone would want to be your CEO who wants to be a CEO.
Yeah.
You appoint a director of the World Economic Forum.
Right. For sure.
Somebody that was so pro-vaccine mandates, pro-masks. Again, I've documented all this on my Substack on Radical Media.
What is the role of money in all of this? If the end game or an end game is to move people from this legacy fiat financial system that is collapsing, right? We're actually actively contributing to destroying that illusion to move people into another illusion, which is the CBDC. Does that make money the end? I mean, this is the end of these psychological operations, is that you're again, we're back to these narratives being peddled such that you can steal from people or put people into a complex where they can be controlled or stolen from at will.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at you don't need me to tell you, but if you look at the fiat system, what we thought was post-colonial liberation, at least on a macro level, wasn't. On a macro level, all those countries that basically gained independence after colonialism are still slaves on a macro level. What post-colonialism achieved was that the physical presence was no longer there. But But those countries aren't independent. They don't have the ability to set their own economic policies because they're all tied to the fiat system, which is basically the US dollar standard around the globe. And the policies in that system are determined by those that control the source of money, which is the Federal Reserve. And so really, again, one of the illusions that's falling away and that we're all becoming aware of at the moment is just how enslaved we are to that system. And you can see it. You can see how the transfer of wealth that happened in the COVID mandate period, you can see how when they shut everything down and when they started printing money, in the UK, we had this thing called the furlough scheme. We were all locked in our homes and the government started printing money. It started giving us money to stay in our homes. Now, that was similar to the universal basic income model. You can see how if we are dependent on our monthly check from the government, how it becomes very easy to turn that off if you say something that the government doesn't like. Now, again, on Rogan, I said that was going to happen. In the 3-week period that podcast was censored, lucky for me, Canada switched the tap off when it came to money. If you remember with the truckers protest, they switched the tap off and they said, we're not going to send you these donations. That happened in that 3-week period where they banned the episode. And I'd said in the episode, that's what they have the power to do. When Canada did that, it was one of the videos I put up, said, see, they had to release the episode eventually. If you watch back that episode now, it doesn't, it states all these things. We have to remember it's before all these things happened. But now we can see how they can control people's access to money. They can literally switch it off. Now, CBDCs, of course, is a much more severe level of control than even the fiat system. So to move away from that, when I say decentralization, whether it's Bitcoin, which I tend not to avoid debates around, I know there's a fierce debate in there. Obviously Bitcoin appears to meet that standard of decentralized currency. And then you've got the question of whether or not the privacy is there because of the record being on the blockchain ledger of every transaction. And but whether or not it's private, it certainly is decentralized. But whether it's Bitcoin or it's currencies around the world being based on the gold standard, and gold being the thing that the currencies are pegged to, so that anyone that has gold has value. Either way, what we need to make sure we do in this time of flux is make sure we never end up in a CBDC system. If we end up with central bank digital currencies being the only thing that, as a means of exchange, that we can use as money, then we are permanently enslaved until the end of time.
Yeah, very, very dystopian, and we have to avoid it. Agreed completely. Let me ask you this. So if the purpose or the aim of these psychological operations, of these narratives that the state is spinning up for us they're intended to guide our behavior in certain directions, but again, they're also used as like cover stories for theft, right? Whether it's the printing of money or outright seizures, as we saw with the Canadian truckers, or other capital controls, et cetera, et cetera. Hypothetically, if we move into a world where, say, we're on a Bitcoin standard and inflation is no longer possible, right? The printing of money is not possible. Taxing these assets, an asset like Bitcoin, is much more difficult than taxing something like real estate. That in theory, the carrot or the incentive for the state to fabricate these narratives and steal people's stuff would be drastically reduced. Like, it'd be harder to steal people's stuff. Is it possible in that world then that we have less PSYOPs, less bullshit, less fabricated narratives, because there's a lowered economic incentive to deceive people since it's harder to steal from them?
Well, if we end up with smaller government,
then
everything becomes less.
And
I think we would. If we end up with decentralized everything, decentralized monetary system, decentralized media narratives. With the media, I think we're headed there already. You can see it. Then government becomes smaller. If government becomes smaller, it has less power. And if it has less power, then its ability to engage in these mass psyops is diminished. But ultimately, any institution that has dominion over human beings will naturally attempt to sustain itself, and it will sustain itself by creating an illusion around its strength. But it will be smaller. Government has become, it's gotten too large. way too large. Whether here in the US, the UK is even worse. When I say large, I mean centralized.
Yes.
In the UK, what a lot of Americans may not realize or remember is that we had a year-long national lockdown, right? That means our entire country was locked down for a year in our homes. That's the lockdown we came out of. We weren't allowed to sit on park benches. They were taped. We were allowed out once a day. We were not allowed to visit our elderly relatives when they were dying in hospitals. My grandmother died, and I only saw the funeral. By the time the funeral came around, we were allowed socially distanced funerals. Before, and I got lucky. That was lucky. Before that, we weren't even allowed to go to funerals. That's how much power the UK centralized state has. It is absurd. And there is no constitution. There's no Bill of Rights. In my recent dialogue with Sam Harris, the recent one, which was on my Substack, it's a 3-hour-long one, because he took the polar opposite view to us on the stuff. So I said to him, come and talk to me, because this is really, Sam, I don't think you realize the consequences of what you're saying. So there's a 3-hour conversation where I think by the end of it, he began to see the consequences of what he was saying. Because the point I was making is you were being very American-centric. You took for granted that the rest of the world had a constitution, had a Bill of Rights. But you didn't realize that we were locked, as a consequence of the narrative you were supporting, we were locked in our homes, the entire country, for a year. Civilians were beaten by police for going for a walk over something that now we all agree had an infection fatality rate similar to the flu, 0.03%. So, it's important to remember that the world isn't America, that we don't have enshrined rights. And even the US government's too centralized. Just imagine what the rest of the world's like.
Right. Yeah, very well said. Okay, to wrap up, so you are a man that has had quite the wide spectrum of life experience, more so than I almost of anyone else I can think of. If you had to distill the wisdom you've gleaned from life so far into something that you wanted to pass on to the next generation or to your own children, perhaps even as in your role as a father, what are the most critical or indispensable values and lessons you've learned in life that we should try and impart to the next generation to make them resistant to this recurrent tendency for humans to try and deceive other humans to steal their shit?
Look, it's strange to say it because I'm still relatively young at 45, but I have actually lived multiple lifetimes in terms of what most people have seen in life. I've been through a torture dungeon and sat this close with President Bush. I've sat this close with Prime Minister Blair, Prime Minister Cameron. I've advised heads of state, and I've been left alone in a dungeon. I've seen the both extreme ends of life, and I only say this to say that I've arrived at something, and it's that we've got to stop pretending that no matter how smart we think we are, no matter how much we think we've figured out, that even collectively, let alone individually, but let's start with individual. No matter how smart we individually think we are, and no matter how smart we think we as a civilization have become, there is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of accumulated human wisdom, probably from before we even realize. If you go into some of the Graham Hancock and the ancient Egypt conversation, with that Netflix documentary did, but probably before we even realize, there's accumulated human wisdom. We're not smarter than that. The sum of how smart we are isn't smarter than the sum of all existence.
That's right. Yeah.
What does that mean then? It means that tradition has value. So that's the advice I'd give. Let's not pretend we can reinvent the wheel. There is millennia of human beings who've decided that the state isn't God. This idea is a modern one, that the state is God. In fact, human civilization up until this point has rejected that idea, which is why up until modernity, most humans had a sense of spirituality and a sense of wonder about the mystical elements. So I think that what I'd say to whether it's my son or anyone else is that as we hurtle through this illusion that is life, which is fleeting and it's temporary. And kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut, every soul should taste death. This is a temporary, fleeting moment. That's a passage of the Quran. But as we hurtle through this, we've got to remember that the best we can do is try and hold on to reality and stay grounded and seek truth. And in doing so, that truth we're seeking, it's more likely that it resides in that tradition that has millennia of experience backing it than me today writing a book.
Sure.
Thinking I've discovered the answers.
Right.
Now, to get that, to access that, I'd argue, find a living spiritual teacher. Find a living mentor. And that living teacher, by the way, it's not enough finding a living teacher because they could have taught themselves in books. Find a living teacher that has had a living teacher that had a living teacher that goes back in a chain of tradition. That's my teacher. Sheikh Ali Abdul Qadir was taught by somebody going back to the Prophet Muhammad in an unbroken chain.
Wow.
My Quran teacher that I had in prison, who under whom I memorized half of the Quran, and I'm going to complete the other half, inshallah, hopefully in my lifetime. He had a teacher that went back to the Prophet Muhammad. And I've written all of those names down in the prison copy of the Quran I had in my handwriting in pencil. I've got those names. I can tell you exactly who taught him back to the Prophet Muhammad. Find a living teacher that has that chain of transmission that takes you back to your heritage. That connection with our past is so important. And I'll end on this point. I'll say what I said to Jordan Peterson. This Bedouin sense that our future is behind us and our past is ahead of us, not the other way around. And that requires a bit of unpacking. Our past is ahead of us and our future is behind us. So let's start with the easy one. The future is behind us. Because the future is an imagination and you imagine it and it's now past tense. The future is nothing but imagination. It's behind you. You're imagining something that you want to achieve. Right? So it's just happened. And really, your past is ahead of you. Why? Because what you leave behind is your future. Your children.
Your legacy.
Your legacy, right? So what you leave behind is the future. So your past is ahead of you, right? Your children that you leave behind are going to be the ones that carry on. So what really matters is that. And we've got to give them a sense of the importance of the past, because it's their future. That's why tradition is so important. And we've got to give them a sense that if globalism is to succeed, and corporatism and globalism, if they're to succeed, then they will only succeed by creating dislocation, by creating individualism in its extremes. Because to have this globally mobile class in this kind of global bureaucracy, in which the only thing that matters is corporate power, and in which truth is defined by that corporate power, human beings must be dislocated, broken from any sense of family and community, so that they are pliable and maneuverable for the purposes of capital, so that capital can move them around for profit. It's why in modern cities you find individuals living away from community and family in boxes, in pens, in like small apartments with one room. And not able to sustain relationships, not married, perpetually single. Because that suits capital. You're mobile. You can be today in London, tomorrow in Hong Kong. If you're posted to Singapore, fine, you can go. You've got nothing tying you down. That suits capital. So that's the future they want. They want the kind of future where relationships are fleeting and temporary, where there's no permanent love. It's just, consumption in the sense of sexual consumption, or food consumption, or financial consumption, but it's all about consumption because the only thing that matters is the narcissistic individual. That suits capital. So I'd say that the opposite of that is what we need. We need a sense of tradition, community, family, and spirituality. That grounds us in a reality, and that reality that will be ultimately a product of our collective consciousness. It will be a manifestation of everything that we value. So we have to know what we value and why. And then we have to work to build that. So, it's why even since COVID, I said I returned to a firm appreciation of my tradition. And never left the Islamic faith tradition, but I have returned to it in a way that I take it very seriously in my own personal conduct. And it's what I hope to impart. I have a 6-year-old. It's what I hope to teach him as well.
It's a beautiful framing. Thank you for everything that you do. I really appreciate your perspectives on all of this. I think it's a very complicated area to try and talk about both our cognition and then how our cognition is manipulated in PSYOPs and whatnot. Yeah. It's a difficult thing to disentangle because it's always contained within language. Of course. But you do a wonderful job of breaking it down. Maajid, where can people find you on the internet?
So I'm probably one of the most shadow banned accounts, but I've got a Twitter account. It's you have to search it out. But actually, my content these days, because after my cancellation, I was kicked off all the airwaves and stuff. So you can find my my commentary on maajidnawaz.substack.com. I call it Radical Media, and there I publish free articles for people, which is a commentary on the state of globalism as it progresses. And the audio content is behind a paywall, but that's where I publish in-depth conversations. So my one with Sam Harris, it's behind the paywall, and some of the other live streams that we do, we publish as audio files there as well. But for the moment, that's where I am. I'm not sure things will change for the foreseeable future because I don't think that any corporate media entity is going to want to hire me anytime soon. To be fair to them, I did have some offers after they cancelled me, but I took the view that that was an attempt to ensnare me once again. Actually, what we need in this moment is to be able to speak freely. So I think independent platforms is the way forward. What you're doing and what others are doing in terms of podcasts, we've really got to decentralize and democratize this space.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Maajid, thank you so much for doing this.
Pleasure.
It was great having you on, and appreciate you being a guest in our home.
It's a lovely studio, and I wish you the best of luck. You've been going since when, 2019?
Started November 2020, but like I said, this just started. So
well, it's great. It's a lovely place and a lovely space to be in.
Yeah,
and happy to continue staying in touch, and also anything in the future going forward. If there's anything that in terms of just cross-posting, whatever, let me know. I'm happy to stay in touch and collaborate in any way.
Perfect. Likewise. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.